My name is Maggie Hennefeld, and it is my pleasure to be in conversation today with Professor Diana Anselmo, author of the fabulous new book, A Queer Way of Feeling, Girl Fans and Personal Archives of Early Hollywood, which is hot off the press from the University of California Press in their wonderful Feminist Media Histories book series. So A Queer Way of Feeling is a gorgeous book and an exhilarating read from cover to cover. It focuses on the archives of queer female movie fans coming of age in the 1910s, looking at their scrapbooks, their fan mail, their male-voiced poetry, collage art, diary entries, amateur photography, and much, much more. And Diana, as you write incisively in your introduction, on pages 2 to 3, these girl fans used motion pictures to articulate feelings not aligned with dominant views on gender, sexuality, propriety, and well-being. This book proposes that by examining personal materials produced by movie-going girls during the emergence of Hollywood's star system, we recover an unknown history of media reception shaped around homoerotic identification, same-sex desire, and gender nonconformity. Adolescent girls deployed the protean syntax of film stardom to forge a foundational language of female nonconformity and kinship. And I just love the way you write so much. It's such beautiful prose. It creates a kind of irresistible movement and energy that made your book impossible for me to put down, and really does justice to the crucial archival materials that you explore. So just to get started, I want to invite you. First of all, I realized that you never introduced yourself either.
That's okay.
So please introduce yourself and tell us all about how you got into this project, how the research kind of got off the ground, and then how you went about adapting your dissertation into a book project.
Thank you so much. I want to just start by thanking you and thanking like the whole infrastructure that allows me to talk about this, the New Review for Film and Television Studies journal. My name is Diana Anselmo. I got into this project kind of accidentally. So I was really interested in girl culture, and I went to grad school really obsessed with Buffy the Vampire Slayer and just depictions of girl power, because I came of age in those 90s where that was such like a popular slogan. And when I started doing that work in grad school, I was very attracted to the notions of girlhood that were in vogue at the time, but I didn't feel like I had anything to say that wasn't like fan shouting. It felt like I was approaching the object itself as just a fan, and I didn't have anything like critical to contribute to it. And I had no interest whatsoever in early cinema. I didn't think about it in any way. Like, it wasn't part of my vernacular growing up. I was very much the kind of person that consumes what is popular at the time. There was no kind of like elegant approach to thinking about a long history. And that was very important, I think, having like an experience in grad school that introduced me, because I went to grad school for visual studies at the University of California at Irvine, and they had a very particular way of thinking of moving in still image that really complicated the way that I thought about media, because I thought about media very much about what was happening at the time, very much television and film, and that's it. So I was blessed with ignorance to a certain extent, because when I think sometimes when you go to grad school or when you start a project, you feel that if you don't know already enough to feel confident to enter the field, you feel almost shy, or that you don't have the entitlement of entering the field. I was ignorant enough to have a lot of passion, but I didn't know. I was open to what could come my way. And I was directed to start thinking about the origins of conversations about girlhood in grad school. And that drew me into the beginning of the moving image, which was having conversations with still image, with painting and illustration of the 19th century. And so as I entered thinking about early cinema as the origin point for this idea of the fangirls, and how it had a conversation with girlhood that was coming from the 19th century, it put me in this nice position of thinking of girlhood as something that had a past in the still image, but that blossomed in a commercial way when the movies became the mass popular entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that led me to scrapbooks in a very kind of like random moment of thinking how much attraction I had for the still image and how much girlhood permeated the still image. And even in conversations about early cinema, because we've lost so much of it, of the original prints, I would find a lot of the information in the print press. So I would find the girls being drawn or illustrating the motion picture film magazines of that time, fan magazines of that time. So I think that bridging of the still image, of the illustration and early cinema allowed me to start thinking about film, not just driven by film archives, but by the paraphernalia and the materiality of other archives.
I love that. I love that so much, and especially this notion of being blessed with ignorance. And it's fascinating. I mean, you do talk about a number of lost films, and archives are always, scrapping, as it were, for more um, material, even just paratextual material on films that are irreversibly lost, right? Over 80% of the silent film archive is potentially lost irretrievably. But as you point out, these fan materials are forms of authorship in themselves that maybe we can really use to supplement and enrich our understanding of lost films. So I love your approach to girl fandom and the origin point of early cinema via the kind of still image of these queer female fan movie archives. But on the topic of archives, I want to hear so much more about where and how you did your research for this project. It's so expansive. I mean, you really are you have access to such personal materials from girls coming of age over a century ago. What was it like to kind of use the finding aid to access these sort of scrapbooks and illustrated collages in various archives and libraries you consulted? As well as, it seems like some of these scrapbooks you came across via eBay, maybe you purchased from the internet, and others maybe you accessed through digitized databases such as Lantern. How did you compile this archive?
So this is one of those things that I wish I had a really neat origin story for one day I woke up and it's like scrapbooks, like lightning bolt. I have no memory of when it really came together. I know that it came together because we had moved, me and my partner, to a 1920s bungalow out of LA. And there was this sense of history and like people left things behind, not from the turn of the century, but from 20 or 30 years ago. And I started that house and the remodeling of the house and the finding of this kind of like old historical pieces drew me into thinking, where were the materials of the fangirls that were not being published in the press or being depicted in the movie screens, right? We knew that there's very expensive and a really elegant scholarship about movie struck girls and how they were being depicted in the press and the screens, things like Shelley Stamp's books, right? And so I kept wondering, where are the historical traces of those girls, the real girls, the everyday girls, the anonymous girls that wrote the letters or that were being talked at in the magazines or in these film narratives about the fangirl? Because if you have surviving films, I was watching one today, like The Picture Idol, right? A Vitagraph film from 1912, where there is a girl that is obsessed with Maurice Costello and like has her bedroom plastered with these pictures that she took out of the film fan magazines. So this stereotype existed, but I really wanted to know if those were the practices that these girls were enacting, of like taking the pictures, gluing them to their notebooks, to their walls, where were the proof? And so I got motivated for that, and I started thinking about eBay. And I am very in debt to finding aids in general, like from Google to eBay to very discrete ones in specific women's colleges archives like Smith or Radcliffe. I'm also immensely in debt to the Media Archive Project for all their databases, particularly where it touches press, things like the archives of Photoplay or Motion Picture Classic and magazine. But the scrapbooks are an enormously long, painstaking labor, because what you do is, in my case, I would enter the word scrapbook of this period, World War I or the 1910s, in all these finding aids, eBay, all the women's colleges that I could think that were active at the turn of the century. And other kinds of like estate sales that sometimes would appear online. I
Wow.
would constantly be trying, and as we know, sometimes they're highly obtuse. Even places like Margaret Herrick, there are libraries dedicated just to motion pictures, can not be sure of what they have in the miscellaneous category. That happened at the Library of Congress, where I went there and I was looking at their paper prints and all these kinds of materials that they have, like the scripts regarding lost films from the 1910s. And I started just asking around while I was spending time at the Library of Congress in Washington, if they had any kind of scrapbooks, and they were like, oh God, maybe in the manuscript division, let's shoot an email. And then they showed up with a couple that are now my epilogue.
Oh,
But yeah, exactly, from the 1920s, and it's like 30 volumes of them. And I was like, why isn't this better catalog? And it's like, because it's that manuscript. Scrapbooks are so hybrid that sometimes they end up in the miscellaneous category, or some archives don't know what to do with them. So they might be under an everyday schoolgirl that went to Smith, and it says, personal papers from an alumna. And then you go and you find that it's filled with film materials or with scrapbooks, but that was the job. The job was to go physically to the places and rummage. Online got me through the door of having like this ghostly impression of what might have been behind the internet. But only when I was in person did I really needed to get my hands dirty. It took at least 6 or 7 years, many trips to Tacoma in Washington for like this small municipal historical archive. It took me to like the women's colleges such as Smith and Vassar and Radcliffe. It took me to Berkeley, Berkeley, the university, all these places that allowed women to achieve higher education in the 1910s. And there's no good explanation. Like Berkeley has these film scrapbooks from the 1914-16s from St. Louis. And I was like, why is a person who grew up in Missouri here? And they're like, we don't know. What's the relationship? Why did you end up collecting this? We don't know. There's like the provenance, the loss of provenance is another big problem for me, because I found many on eBay that were super interesting, beautiful collages, but nobody knows where it came from. Nobody knows who collected it. And so there was a body of work that is still a very interesting repository of film ephemera that some of them might be the only copies of this kind of pamphlet or the kind of memorabilia that was given away at the time of this screening in this specific local theater. But I couldn't utilize them because I didn't know who the compiler was. And that was one of my brackets, because I can tell you that once you go digging for this kind of personal memorabilia, you will fall down a rabbit hole and find a ton of stuff. And you have to figure out a way of parsing it.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine how much labor was involved in compiling the archives that you do include in your study, whereas it sounds like your research at this point maybe even consists mostly of outtakes. But this is a great advisory message, maybe for grad students listening to this, getting started on your dissertation projects. Don't rely on digitized databases alone. You'll never imagine what you can find in the material archives themselves, handling materials, especially sort of wading through unmarked collections, and trying to sleuth out the provenance of tantalizing objects. Sometimes that's where it begins, with an enigmatic object that you don't know how to categorize or define, that you find in an archive, and then, 10 years, 350 pages later, here you go. But I want you really emphasize the kind of tactility and even the affective charge of these archives, which I think you use language like some of these objects are pulsing with queer erotic feelings and non-normative gender desires. So I'd be curious to hear more about sort of your own affective orientation to some of these scrapbooks and other ephemera and materials. Like, obviously, there are barriers to physical touch within the space of the archive, especially, if it is the singular, unique object, the only copy that exists of this female fan's scrapbooks. Were you handling some of these collections with gloves? And did it make a difference, say, when you were able to buy a scrapbook from eBay and just kind of, leaf through it as you would, without any kind of official barriers, maybe in the space of your own home or LA bungalow?
This is a great question. And he actually goes right back to, I have to be so thankful for you having enjoyed the prose and having enjoyed just reading it. Because I think one of the things when I started writing, because this ended up not being my dissertation, the ideas of early cinema and girlhood and trying to find a voice to the girls that loved the movies in the 1910s is the heartbeat of my dissertation. But this kind of queerness was not there, or was very much like just a vein running through, and it wasn't in any way like it wasn't the heartbeat of the project. So I'm in debt to, when I submitted the manuscript to the University of California Press, Shelley Stamp, Raina, and a few other people that remained anonymous were the ones that were kind of like teasing out and like pointing towards discovering further this queer affect in the materials. And what I thought, I didn't have any confidence in it, because the way I felt, this goes back to what I was saying, that I went to grad school as a fan and came out as a critical thinker, because I am very wary of loving something and working on it. So, because I think that sometimes when one is really close to the object, I always use the expression, you're too close to the flame. So you can't see it, you can't see what is critically there and the multiple kind of like nuances of it, because you're too in it. And I had a lot of uncertainty about writing about these materials because I was physically in love with them.
Wow.
And so I own the only copies of many of them. Some of them have memorabilia from the trenches. You're touching, everybody is dead. All the actors, all the people that put this together, their family members, you're all dead, because all of these things were compiled by teenagers in 1915, 17, 18, right? So you're always touching dead stuff. And when there's hair and there's memorabilia of people that died young, or there is like their kissing of a piece of paper that they save, all of that feels like really close. And writing about that kind of ephemera felt like I couldn't write in a very formal way, because I felt very deeply impacted. And I was writing about materials that people collected and kept because they're trying to preserve it against death and against memory loss and destruction. So you feel that they were motivated by a similar enormous amounts of love or affect. And so there's this intoxicating quality of just being immersed in it, which on one hand, I was very thankful for the archive, because you put some brackets and distance on the engagement. And it created that sensation of like, I'm here for 10 days. And I would let myself go through as many of the objects as I could, slow down or speed up, or whenever it felt right. There were times when I went to Berkeley for one specific collection, maybe 3 or 4 times. And there's many diaries and many scrapbooks that this young woman put together. And she has really painful, difficult handwriting. And so I would get burned out, because you're reading like 150 pages of tiny, like inked handwriting, cursive. And I get so burned out, and I didn't want to read it anymore. So I would have to like leave and come back a year later. And so there's all this labor that goes into your body of like, I need to take a break. I haven't eaten, my eyes are sore, my body aches. And so the archive was positive in that way, of creating the bracket of like, go home and think about Constance again next year. And it gave me the opportunity to go home and then tell my partner, oh, this is what I learned about Constance. And these people became part of our life. Sometimes I'm like writing a paper just about one of them, and she's like, is this the Florence or is this the Constance? Who's you're writing now? The ones I bought myself, I am much messier with. And maybe this sounds like almost counterintuitive, but the archive imposes a certain amount of respect. I feel really transgressive, because sometimes the most important thing about an object, it's on the recto verso. So you have to like slowly unpeel it from the page and hope that the librarian isn't seeing it, so you can read what was glued upon or which kind of PS is behind. And you find, again, as you said, and I want to reiterate it, what you find online can be like an arrow pointing in a certain direction, but you need to get your hands dirty and go to the archive, because sometimes I get even like images that very kindly the librarian send me as a JPEG. And then when I'm there in person, everything is different. The tears in the page, the smells, the smudges, the things written on the back. So the things I buy are really suffering, because I put them in my closet. California is not known for being well insulated for heat. They have lived through at least 5 different states and moves at this point, because I started collecting them back in 2012. And I have this standing arrangement with Harvard that they're going to own them when I'm done. And it's like 10 years later and they're like, are you done? And I'm like, not yet. So it's difficult to own the objects because you simultaneously love them like a family member, but you also treat them with the same kind of familiarity that you do with a loved one, which is with a certain amount of careless because you're used to them being always there.
Mm.
And so sometimes I'm not very careful with them, and I don't feel bad about it because there's something about touching them. Like sometimes I do talks about this book and I take one of them with me just for people to touch and smell and see. And when there's archivists around, if I'm doing this in a museum, they freak out and they're like, oh God, this is too much. You can't let the only piece of history we touch by like these undergrads. But there's something really magical when you realize that you're introducing this object that is 100 years old and these people that have been long dead to these people that are so alive right now. And suddenly silent film and, fangirls of the 1910s are not intangible and distant. They're not apparitions. They're real. And so I think that links the way I also write about the objects. The physicality of them make them intimate and make them real in a sense of they are our precursors. They were us. They love the movies in different and complementary ways to film historians, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that's so palpable in your writing, your kind of tactile relationship, your own physical intimacy with these objects really comes through in the writing in a way that tremendously advances the sort of methodology and the argument intervention of the book itself. Your prose, they really just pulse with life. It's such a pleasure to read. I'm curious, actually, while you're talking about these individual fans, movie scrapbooks, and how they're ghosts of the archive, but they sort of come back to life momentarily through the ephemera these women and teenage girls leave behind. Have you been in touch with any of their family members or kin individually?
Yeah, a few times. One case they approached me because they saw that I published about this particular Berkeley girl. Her name is Constance Margaret Topping, and she lived in Berkeley all her life. She went to college there. She never got married, and she lived to be very old, into her late 80s. And so this person that had known her, because Constance grew up to be involved with an Asian American immigrant community. So this was one of the people that had, I think she was even a godchild. Constance had been very close to this person's parents and had been involved in this woman's life when she was younger. And she knew some things of her as an old lady alive, real, when this person was alive. So she did reach out to me and was like, oh, you wrote about someone that is still like somewhat of a family member, was a family friend. I would love what do you know about her? Because I didn't have access to her materials and you, the scholar, did. Do you have any photos or can you tell me how to go about finding aids at the University of California, Berkeley? And so it was a really interesting report because this person is also a professional in completely different, like international politics, so completely different field from mine. But she did provide some insight on how I knew Constance very well as a teenager, and of course this person couldn't know her because she's still alive today, right? But she knew her as an older lady, so there was conversations about her. And it was interesting, for example, that Constance was really in love with D.W. Griffith early on, like when Birth of an Asian was being made. It was her favorite film. She kept a lot of, let's call it less tasteful paraphernalia that was being given. But again, they are probably one of the few examples of the film being marketed as The Klansman. And she has this hooded figure, right, a Ku Klux Klan member cut out that was being given away as just a free giveaway ephemera, right? She has glued it in her scrapbook, and it's obviously a difficult thing to encounter. But this lady that knew her as an older person was like, oh, she always loved D.W. Griffith. Even in the 80s when I knew her, she would still say that nobody made movies like Griffith did in the teens and 20s. So it was interesting that there was a couple of times where I reached out to people that I knew they were kin of someone. I had found their scrapbook on eBay. They were not involved with that sale, and they were still in mourning for the loss of that sister. So they were incapable of wanting to talk. They freaked out, honestly. They're very much like, how did you? I guess they donated all the materials to like estate sale and eventually found its way to eBay. And they were freaked out by the idea of someone else having personal materials. They came around a year or two later, And they were just like, I'm sorry. I just imagining my little sister when she was a child making that scrapbook. She had just passed. So those are
Wow.
the most remarkable experiences.
Yeah, wow, I can only imagine. And you really do follow up on a number of these women in the book. Like, you know quite a bit about their biography well after they
Yeah.
stopped, doing movie scrapbooking. Like, I love the story you tell about Edna Verco, who, so she's the one who became a teacher, right?
Yep.
Because she loved handicraft, she loved working with her hands. And she had a kid, but never married. Like, I like the way you really sort of round out or follow up on the trajectory of their desires that we can see glimpses of um, in the materials from their movie fandom that they compiled. So it's not just a snapshot in time, but also a projection into the future of how their lives themselves would unfold. I found those biographical threads so tantalizing. Speaking of movies themselves, I'm trying to find a way to pivot from your mention of Birth of a Nation that for the rest of this conversation sidelines the legacy of D.W. Griffith. So I'll just do this as awkwardly as I can manage. One thing that really stands out about your book, say in contrast to other studies of queerness, female to male cross-dressing, lesbianism, and silent cinema, like Laura Horak's work and Susan Potter's work, is that you really don't focus on films themselves, but the kind of attention, the sort of critical, close reading that we might bring to film analysis, you really devote to your analysis of these female fan scrapbooks. So you engage with the still images and the kind of collages that women create, like Alice Scheffler's collages of Edna Mayo, with these kind of dramatic close-ups juxtaposed to an image of her with the male character cut out next to her female maid, or entangled bodies of men in a still from Betty of Greystone in 1916. So you really are doing a kind of close analysis of the collage images that these queer or queer-aligned female fans created in their own movie scrapbook. So I want to invite you to talk about first of all, why, you mentioned briefly some serial queen films like Pearl of the Army or The Perils of Pauline that do kind of include and thematize images of cross-dressing, but you don't say much more about them beyond that. Why sideline the films? Why not do close readings of the films that survive? And what's the importance of really dedicating the same degree of attention to these fan ephemera instead of to the
Yeah.
movie?
Yeah, I think it was exactly because at the time that I was thinking, I think it comes from the fact that I'm not coming from a film program. So I was coming from comp lit and psychology before, and then I went to visual studies, which was very hybrid between art history, cultural studies, and film. But even the way they did film there was very much within the cultural and critical studies approach. It wasn't let's sit and analyze the mise-en-scène of this particular film. I think it was that my mind was shaped by the cultural studies approach, but I also think there was already a sort of excellent surveys, like you're saying, Potter, Horak, of thinking about the films as a space where queerness was being rehearsed. And of course, there is enormously popular and important work like Jackie Stacy or Patricia White, right, where they talk about how gestures and subtext were ingrained in classical Hollywood. So I was informed by already knowing of this scholarship. And similar to when I went to grad school, just because I loved girl depictions, I wanted to find a way that there was something I wanted to say that wasn't just reiterations of what had been done brilliantly before by feminist scholars. So it was a difficult process in a way, because I think that I knew I didn't want to do formal analysis, in part, again, because it wasn't my speed. It wasn't what spoke to me. And it wasn't what I felt like I was just going to reiterate what other people did. So I really wanted to give the spotlight to, instead of just talking about fangirls in this way that it's been, even in the best studies, we think about them a bit uniformly. And of course, my book has the handicap of the lack of survival of materials by people of color and the lack of preservation of materials by people of color at this time. And I lived in Georgia for a few years and turned around all of those co-ed schools that were there around the turn of the century, and no materials have been saved. Even in historical Black colleges, there is no materials from the teens. Many
Wow.
of them appear more towards the late 20s or even the 30s, really more classical Hollywood times. And many of them, and I think this is because of the urgency of political and civic revolution in the South, many of them are not concerned with preserving objects of leisure, such as scrapbooks of films. They're much more involved with people with students that were involved in like political organizations, right? So I remember talking with archivists that thought the project and the materials were wonderful, but there simply was not a push to record these kinds of materials at that time. And when the time came to preserve materials of people of color, particularly Black Americans in the South, the priority was given to materials that were much more like seen as socially engaged. So there is this kind of, I wanted to do the best I could to give the center stage to the girls that went to the movies and disassociate them from the uniform idea of the screen-struck girl and individualize them. And I think that's part of the biographical attention and the close reading of how they collaged or how many siblings they had or what did they do with their lives. And the vast majority of them decided not to get married, and a good majority of them as well pursued higher education in professions that offered a certain measure of independence. And I think that was part of my drive. I wanted to move away from the commercial, the industry studies that focus more on the formal analysis and thinks of audiences as more these kinds of either uniform or very demographically based. I think of things like Jackie Stacey's wonderful book about British women looking at classical Hollywood. And it was very much like a questionnaire directed the kinds of responses she collected. And I didn't want to direct anything. I wanted it to be as much as like a medium in the spiritualist sense, which I know it sounds esoteric, but I really wanted the materials to speak to me. I didn't want to force anything. And there's something about the films that force you, to me as a scholar, the film has a history and it has a depiction that forces you to stay in those brackets. And there's a little bit less of imaginative freedom. And I think I reveled, even though I was trying to write something that was in historiography with the kind of academic criticality that one can apply to historiography, I still wanted a little bit of like the play of finding something new and trying to figure out a new method to talk about something I had never read about before, but in flashes. Like Emily Hastings obviously talks about paracinematic objects of women that were involved in classical Hollywood, but they're big stars, right?
Mm-hmm.
Helen Moore or Louise Brooks. I wanted to find a way to talk about materials that have no cloud. They have no industrial or commercial endorsement. And although, of course, they're in conversation with early film industry and therefore in conversation with commerce, there's a reason why the materials that survive is of women that had some pocket money and literate, right? They had literacy, they had the capacity of collaging, cutting, writing, but it still allowed, particularly the Florence Lawrence collection of fan mail, you find a lot of urban working girls, immigrant girls. So you still find a lot of like diversity that goes beyond just screen-struck girls and that imagination that we have on the screen. When you see a movie-struck girl on the screen, you're going to see a white, well-curated, of a certain kind of body type, a certain kind of age star playing that part. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to stay in the everyday. And I thought that way I could complement the work of the scholars that came before me, such as Potter and Horak, and their wonderful studies of what the screen did with queerness, in which ways the screen created queerness. I wanted to think how audiences created and read queerness.
I love it. That's so beautiful. And this is such a rich kind of I don't know, genealogy of feminist and queer historiographic scholarship in recent years that you outline. And you really like looking at these fan letters. It really reveals queerness in the movies in ways where we wouldn't be able to find it if we were only looking at the surviving reels themselves, right? Yeah. Because it comes out of the collage, out of the sort of erotic gaze that these female fans, bring to the screen. And I think you do formal analysis. I think you do formal analysis, not of the films, but of the ephemera, like the way you read Clara Moore's homoerotic stationery in her fan letters to Florence Lawrence, which is, I had no idea of the kind of degree of back and forth of correspondence between the stars and the fans, the way in which Lawrence and other movie stars would write back to, their most devoted female fans and, become sort of pen pals or interlocutors. I'm just like, there's this one sentence from page 78 of your book that's so tantalizing. I have to read it aloud. Like sedimentary rock, each stratum of meaning adds to the libidinal texture.
I love how you read it. It does have an erotic charge when someone else reads it.
It's so great. And I'm just thinking too, there's been such a turn in the field of feminist historiography, maybe exemplified by the work of the Women Film Pioneers Project, to recuperate the lost, forgotten, or even unrealized authorship of female makers, in particular, directors, producers, writers, but also editors, known as cutters at the time, or color stencilists. And at one point, I think you even draw a comparison between women coloring in black and white images in their movie illustrated collage books, and the heavily gendered female labor of hand stencil coloring, right? Adding color to the moving image. And I wonder how, like you suggest that these women are not just fans, they're also authors. They're creative makers in themselves. They're adding new levels of meaning, if not, libidinal textures to the sedimentary rocks, surviving 35 millimeter film archives. Yeah, how can we think of scrapbooking or other sorts of materials you're finding left behind in these fan ephemera? How can we think about them sort of as aligned with the feminist historiographic project to recuperate traces of feminist authorship from the silent era?
I think that is such a wonderful question, because I think that as an aspiration, as you know so well, like when you start writing a book or an article, whatever, when you start creating something that you're thinking is going to have an audience, it's not just for your drawer, you really think of how you can add to what others that came before you or others that are around you are creating, and how you can create a conversation. And you are so right. The Women Pioneers Project, which is a wonderful teaching tool, and it's a wonderful introductory tool to just understand the gigantic expansiveness of women's participation and contributions for early cinema, and that it really crossed all fields. And I think that I wanted to add to it in this way of showing that some of the girls wanted to be part of movie making. They're waiting for Florence Lawrence to ask how to get a job. Sometimes it's as an actress, but sometimes as a screenwriter, as a writer, or just get in the business. They are not even necessarily saying, I have acting aspirations. And I think that the same way that these feminist projects of trying to reclaim voices that we forgot, or positions of labor that we forgot because they're not as celebrated as being an actress or a director, so you forget about the copy editor, or you forget about the illustrator, about the colorist. I think I wanted to do the same from the side of female fans. I wanted to say that even if they didn't make it, if these girls that are writing to Florence Lawrence, or these girls that are creating these collages, even if they didn't make it in the ways that we understand as making it in a capitalistic society, meaning became a really commodified household name that you can like market products from, like Mary Pickford, right? That even if that didn't happen, they were part of film history. And I think this goes towards my interest in complicating feelings, like queerness and complicating the ideas of gender normativity is the center of this project. But in recent projects, as I kind of like expand this line of research, I'm really interested in the idea of failure and of contrarianness, and of not necessarily needing to be successful in our capitalistic framework to deserve your place in history, or you deserve your place in conversations about female contributions in early cinema. So one hand, I'm interested in these women that had aspirations and perhaps they didn't come to fruition in the ways that we would consider successful, but how they still were part of film history by communicating with the stars, by giving them. Florence Lawrence is collecting a lot of these letters when her stardom is starting to fade, when she's been away from the screen for a few years. She's really besieged by a lot of economical and health troubles. So she's in a hard place, and yet she's collecting these like incredibly gushy, loving letters, and which means that there's a care labor that these fans are doing for the star, and that enabled her. She will eventually commit suicide later in life, Florence Lawrence, but they provided a sort of emotional heartbeat, an emotional lifeline for the star, and they are in many ways the lifeblood of early Hollywood. And I would go as far as say of many creative media industry today, is we still use the notion of fangirl, often derogatory, but the truth is where the fangirls go, often a lot of money is made. And it's not just boy bands, it's also all kinds of commercial shows that are now in multiple kinds of platforms, or even the MCU. There's a thriving collective of female identified, queer identified fans there that drive that kind of product to still have a great cloud and drive kind of like the crank, right? The economical power of these intellectual properties. And I think I wanted to do that too. I wanted to inscribe as authors, as creators, these invisible forces that are the fangirls in all their diversity, and how the way that we still talk about what means to be a young woman engaging with media, to what still means to quote unquote fangirl, has its roots in these practices that are being created at the turn of the century, right? Because so much of that focusing, that, like you're saying, Alice Schaefer focuses so obsessively on these men being very intimate with each other physically or roughhousing, and she just cuts these tiny little pieces that are clearly not the major artery of the picture, but she just puts it in, like, arranges it in their pages. And that kind of investment of a female identified young woman, young fan, for male intimacy on the screen and scavenging for it to find like a certain homoerotic pulse, it's really, really pervasive in female fandoms today. The idea of male-male intimacy drives a lot of fan fiction, a lot of collage, a lot of female reception of very popular intellectual properties. So those methods might have changed. The delivery technology of fandom might have changed from paper, letters, collage to digital scrapbooks and to online venting posts and communities. But the ways in which young women articulate and harness and make and manifest their attachment to media and find queerness or non-heteronormative ways of engaging with media that sometimes looks on the surface very heteronormative is similar. So that lineage, I think that's how I also contribute to this idea of like the work of historiography that other feminist scholars are doing, is by saying, I'm placing these young women in history and their practices in history as active participants in creating structures of feeling, but also allowing for the proliferation, the lucrative proliferation of certain intellectual properties. Today, those methods were installed perhaps at the turn of the century, but they're still really vivid and very important today.
Yeah, I love that. And I hope every K-pop stan and MCU fangirl reads your book to understand the kind of foundations of their own maybe queer impulses towards their fandoms. And I love the analogies, the comparisons you draw between the sort of material practice of collaging and scrapbooking in the early 20th century and methods of digital collaging, meme creation, virality, maybe even videographic criticism that we as fans sort of engage with today. One point you really underscore, particularly in the chapter about female fan letters to Florence Lawrence, is the kind of dynamic of intimacy and distance, right? How fan letters and fandom in general is always mediating, you know, this profound feeling of intimacy from an impossible physical distance, almost unbridgeable distance between the fan and the star, even if, you know, the star responds with a personal message, or photograph or professional advice or something of the sort. But one aspect of your historiography that I don't know, maybe appears more marginally in places. You suggest later these fans, after they stop, their scrapbooks turn into less like a kind of collage of queer juxtapositions and more like a logbook or record of movies they've seen, summaries of the movies they watched, maybe who they went with, how they felt at the time during the exhibition. And the space of the theater is always a way of bridging the gap between the kind of phantasmagoria of what you describe as incorporeal film images and the sort of intense physicality and tactility of the sensations, the erotic sensations evoked by fandom. And I wonder if you found any indications or clues or remainder, or what's the word I'm looking for? Traces of I don't know, erotic encounters in the cinema, particularly the examples of movie-struck fans where their queerness is really palpable. It's really legible from what they leave behind in the scrapbooks. Do they ever describe, I don't know, holding hands with another woman, kissing another woman in the theater, or that sort of erotic charge of the scene of exhibition itself?
I wish that would be, no, I wish, because that, I admit, a lot of this work also threads the line with gossip and a certain kind. I'm actually not, I'm not someone that is interested in like contemporary gossip, but I am absolutely fascinated by what you said, which is this idea that the whole of fandom, and even as this historiographer reacted to these objects, is constantly a tug of war between being close and being impossibly far. And I think there is an argument that I've been toying with, that even the relationships of parasociality that we have, that we nowadays describe as like, you know, someone that is really into a K-pop idol and follows them around and has even encounters with them, that the origins of that wanting to be close to the star, and close is never close enough, probably emerges at this time through how film was so good at being everywhere at all times because it was cheap and easy to manufacture and distribute all over the country. But then it was meted out by specific local appearances where you could see the star in the flesh, or by having intermediate products like star-sponsored cosmetics or clothing or special limited collections of spoons, right? Or the perfume they use. So I think there's a perpetuality between you want to be close and you collect the images or the reproductions. You might collect the same clothing. I know that at one point there was girls that were writing to stars asking, female stars, girls writing to female stars asking for their cast out clothing so they could wear. Yeah, that didn't make it. I don't think that made it to the book. That was the thing that recurred a couple of times, just the cast outs, or like, I'm poor, if you could send me some, or like, I'm trying to make it into movies and I know that young stars should have their own clothing, that was something that was expected, that actresses could provide their own wardrobe, and they didn't have it. So there is this other forms of intimacy that you can read between the lines that they want to get between. I'm thinking of the Brooke Shields, Calvin Klein's "Nothing Gets Between Me and My Calvins." And you're like, oh, this female fan wants to get between the star and her dress. So there is this like questions of intimacy. I did find that the movie theater itself becomes a space of intimacy for girls, in the sense of, I want to be with her in the movie theater. They would use this language of like the effusive language of female friendship or romantic friendships to say, it's our special place, or like, we're really close, we go to the movies every day. So it existed in this implicit way that the movie going in the movie theater was a space where two girls could feel close and actualize their special bond. Sexual encounters did take place between girls and boys. So Constance, our Berkeley Constance, is going to have a very embattled relationship with boys. She desires them quite ardently, but they do not reciprocate. So she pursues many, many boys, that she keeps a tally. The same way she keeps a tally of movie scenes, she also has a tally of crushes. or cases, as she called back then. And she does eventually get involved with her cousin, who eventually has a mental breakdown and becomes an hysteric and has to be put away in an asylum. But she does have a sexual encounter with him. Her first kiss and like fondling takes place on her birthday in a movie theater in Berkeley. And she describes going to the movies as like a social activity and finally having a sensual encounter there, which had never happened before and had frustrated her because she knew the movies was a place where, you know, people went to get sexually intimate. So there is that case. And there is one case that is quoted in the book of a survey about sexual attitudes and gender, where one of the young women talks about getting stimulated sexually when she's in the movies, but stimulated by the women on the screen. And she feels really guilty because she doesn't want to be connoted with homosexuality or deviancy. So she's like, I don't feel it for men and I only want to have close relationships with women, but I don't think that means anything. But I feel very bad when I have these, and she describes it as like really hot and bothered feelings when she is witnessing movies that have like women in the throes of passion. Unfortunately, I don't have like declarative me, Joan and Mary went to the cinema and kissed. I would love that, but a lot of implicit content.
We can read between the lines as you do throughout.
Minus the cover. I guess the cover is the most, it's like very explicit, right?
Or watch out for the word morbid.
Oh yeah, the word
queer signifier. It makes me feel morbid.
Oh, I love that. That's such of this book was about my passion for history of medicine, which is like that's my closet passion. I'm in the closet about how much of an historian of medicine I am or want to be. And so I spent a lot of time reading the medical journals regarding same-sex intimacy during the turn of the century and the early 20th century. And he just said it. The fact that it was a code word between doctors, but also patients describing their feelings to doctors, every time they use that word morbid, was often about their sexual impulses and very much about homosexuality, but also about kink. So it's very interesting.
And like you said, some of this specialized medical and psychological terminology was in the process of becoming popularized and thus sort of recuperated by queer subcultures in the 1910s. And that's part of the scaffolding you lay out for the book. I mean, and it really is just such an expansive interdisciplinary study as well in terms of the way you frame the significance of these materials. One thing I wanted to talk about, and you've already touched on this a few times in your comments, is the sort of tension between commoditization and creative self-expression that we see, right? Like the industry was thirsty to harness these fan impulses, first of all, to de-queer them, right? To heteronormativize them through, I don't know, fan contests to write the best, I don't know, poem, or what were some of these fan gimmicks, like submit your own movie scrapbook, but within these really sort of constricting criteria that we can easily control and manipulate and commoditize. Whereas you suggest, like, yes, of course, these archives are shot through with the kind of rhetoric of industry commoditization, but they're also so much more than that, right? They really are. I mean, I'm leafing through my heavily dog-eared copy of your book. Female imagination and fabulation translated into handsome rewards in early Hollywood. And you write this on page 103 in this aptly titled section, Writing Themselves into Stardom, a fan language of queer agency. And there really is agency and a kind of burst of desire that can't be simply kind of commoditized and packaged away under those terms. And maybe we're too cynical now in sort of thinking about how, I don't know, like we're constantly creating unpaid content as gig workers for like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe we are too kind of ready to make the sort of cynical point about creative free labor and not linger enough in the kinds of wayward impulses that are unleashed and activated by that sort of fan engagement and creativity. Yeah, and I'm wondering if you have any more thoughts on that topic, just about the sort of tension between creative self-insertion versus industry commoditization.
I think you're right. I think you're so right. It's so difficult to imagine the moment in which these girls lived, where it was so new. And although, of course, industry was being motivated by profit and it was targeting this demographic once they realized that it was a very productive and lucrative one, I think that there was still this very democratic, all-inclusive appeal coming from the film industry that everybody could be a star. There was a room at the table for everybody that wanted to join if you were plucky and industrious and creative. So I think there is this moment where cynicism is not there yet. And I think that although these girls saw the production of their materials as just part of the conversation, I think there was an understanding that these stars were people that could have gone to school with you, that it could just be your neighbors. Particularly if you were urban, you were seeing these films being shot all over Chicago, New York, later LA. So you did have a feeling of being part of it, that it wasn't something distantly created to extract value from you and treat you just like a body bag, that they drink your blood and your money from you and have no interest in you as a personality, as a person. I think these girls, and you see that recurrently in the letters that are written to Florence Lawrence, they did see themselves as chums. There's a proximity, there's an intimacy that does obviously thread the line between desire, hero worship, and just being courteous and being kind of almost deferent. But I think that one of the things that is really different is that there is an understanding that you're contributing with love. And that is true today. So much of the gig economy, or even fandom, and the idea of like creating, for example, campaigns to rescue shows that are on the chopping block to get canceled. Those kinds of fan-led efforts, or trying to create conventions in which people come and can like generate more interest in that particular endangered intellectual property. Like that kind of, let's say, unpaid fan love was in place there, but it was understood as a proximity that you didn't have to fight the industry or like force the industry to see your point. They were not, the differentiation was not as gigantic. And I think there was an understanding that participation was rewarded in ways that were much more accessible and less biased than nowadays. But I do think that one of the things that remains is that it was love that motivated this. And I think now there's a sensibility that one is likely getting exploited, or that one should be turning every idea, every creative passion work, or every labor of love should have a price tag. And I think we see that a lot with this kind of mix of being a content creator instead of just being a fan or a creative artist, that doing it for fun. You want to make tons of posters of your idol, or you want to make collages, or you want to make, like a painting and give it to your friend because you love it and you share into that love. And I think girls at this time felt that there was a current, there was a double geared sort of electricity current in which they all participated, the stars, the industry themselves, and the fans. And I think now we don't see it that way anymore. And we see it that the only means of participation that seem meaningful are the ones that are handsomely remunerated economically, materially. And I definitely see the difference of imagining that you create these projects just for yourself and for your pleasure, something I shared in my own youth when I didn't grow up with the internet. So if I was deeply in love with something, I might be making like a fanzine that I distributed amongst my immediate group of friends, but I certainly was not thinking I have to take a picture and put it on Instagram because maybe I'll get noticed and make money out of it. But I think but I do think that it's where you can track that idea of creating something for, maybe it can get you like, $10, which is a lot of money in the 1910s. Maybe it can get you $10 for the best poem. But I think there was this understanding that you had more freedom to even be cheeky, or to be a little bit more creative with the means of engagement, because there was an understanding that there was multiple lanes of access to Hollywood and to the stars, to the system. Well, I think now we think that the only means of access is the one that is materially rewarding. That's it. If you produce a collage or a fan fiction or a video and it doesn't have 1,000 or 1,000,000 hits, if it's not noticed by the creators, the official creators, you're somehow less of a fan or a failure. And I think that was not those capitalistic ways of self-thinking, of self-identifying as a fan was starting, because you already have people talking about accumulation of materials as a way to prove that they're a bigger fan than someone else. So it's creeping in. You start seeing it, particularly as the teens advance. But in the early teens, particularly when you read those letters from 09 or 10 or 11 or 12, there's a certain sort of innocence to it. There's a grit to the girls that write and say, I want to do it. I'm this way. I'm this size. I'm this ethnicity, but I still want to do it. But you do see that shifting into more of an understanding of fandom through material accumulation as the decade wears off.
Really, really interesting. No, I love this impulse of unpaid fan love. And obviously it can be a fine line between participation and exploitation. But maybe that sort of unremunerated love, the impulse to create something for other reasons than like professional ambition or going viral, maybe that's something we need to kind of recuperate and hold on to, right? Pay the writers, pay the industry workers, and let the fans have their love, right? Like maybe having a finer distinction between professional writers and gig-based, largely unpaid fan content creators, for example. And you lay out the importance and potentials of those distinctions so beautifully in your book. And one note I wanted to circle around to, and this is something you mention in your conclusion, I get the sense that from all of the materials you found and amassed in your research for queer ways of feeling, a queer way of feeling, some of these will inform your next project on which focuses more on the kinds of negative feelings and affects circulating around queer fan ephemera. You mentioned looking at criminal statements and suicide letters, but also going back into the kinds of scrapbooks and illustrated collages. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that next project.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. You know, it's that liminal place where the same way that this book was not the dissertation, but was just like a flavor in the dissertation, like a through line that needed a lot of time to be kind of excised and shaped into its own individual project. I think that when I was working on this book, there was this last part, because the book was much larger originally. So there was this last part of like 2 or 3 chapters about the negative feelings, because although I feel really vividly and passionately about reclaiming exactly what you said, reclaiming doing something because you love it without expecting anything in return. And I think it's an urgent message, particularly because we are in this moment where everybody turns everything from hobbies to kids to anything into a product, into a commodity, right? And I understand that that has to do with like structural precariousness for many people, but there is something about like the guilt that if you're writing something that it's not for publication in our world, for example, if you're just writing something for yourself or just because you want to share it with your group of friends, which is an impulse that is starting to permeate also as we're discussing fandom, where you can't just write or make something because you love it and you want to share it. You kind of start measuring the success of your fandom and your affective attachments in how many likes, how many blogs, how many followers, how many endorsements, right? So I wanted to start, I wrote this book with the direction of a certain kind of uplift. The idea, like we're discussing, that we have overlooked the individualization of female moviegoers in early Hollywood. And I wanted to really do that the same way that like we're talking about so many other projects dedicated to women pioneers, right? Wanted to individualize. It wasn't just the stars. It wasn't Mary Pickford and etc. It was actually a coterie, a bevy of people. And many of them were really skillful and accomplished women. And with different kinds of skills. That's the thing, like trying to also take away this hierarchy that there's the stars and then there's the others, as if there were less because they're copy editors. So I wanted it to kind of create this inroads to talk about moviegoers, girls that were madly in love with the movies, as not just harebrained or irrational or driven by like boy crazy impulses. And I wanted to show the complexity and queerness here, as you said so well, is about the sexual orientation, but it's also about just pushing against the grain, about being different from the norm and the strictures of gender that were associated with growing up as a quote unquote girl, and particularly a white and then a non-white or a non-wealthy girl. I started thinking about what happened when it wasn't about uplift, when you actually engaged with movies during this time period, which is a time period of immense strife within the country. There is a lot of problems in the social level, a lot of pushes for legislation that are going to end up with suffrage, but also with prohibition, which seems kind of contradictory, and yet happened pretty much at the same time. You have a war raging that is going to, eventually the US is going to get involved. You have the pandemic raging at the same time as the war. So you have like a lot of unhappiness and misery, honestly, happening at this time. And we tend to think, well, girls were probably going to the movies and would put their aspirations and find some respite in the movies. But I started to wonder, what if they didn't? What if the movies were actually the catalyzer or the symptom, and their fandom became the symptom of deeply felt insecurity, self-doubt, bigotry, anger, pain, suffering, mental illness? I started to think about those things, and I started to find objects, either it's scrapbooks, they're really dedicated to star death, or to star. I wrote a piece recently about star divorces and how there is this one fan that just collects all these like mishaps that are taking place in stars' lives instead of celebrating their accomplishments. And then I kind of started searching. We know that there is this wave of panic, right? The morality police is going to start emerging in the 1920s surrounding all these star scandals. And so we know that there is this fear that the movies are actually contagious and a negative influence on vulnerable populations in the early 20s. Yeah. But I wanted, again, to know how, again, individual girls, particularly urban immigrant girls that were not as privileged as we imagine the girls in my book to be, because they are because it's so cloaked with an exploration of writing yourself into star narratives, that the positivity of that, the aspiration of that kind of drives this first book. But I wanted the second book to be inquiring what happens if you don't make it in Hollywood and you take your life because of that frustration. What happens if the movies send you on a path of being a runaway and then you fall with the wrong crowd and your life spins out of control? And it's not so much the movies didn't make you do it, but they were a factor in certain decisions that may have led to less fortunate lives. And of course, I want to just investigate those lives, that often it was about them living in tenements or having working lives where they were really poorly remunerated and were being exploited, and they were trying to find alternatives, and when those alternatives, movie making, was foreclosed, they gave up on life. But I want to really think about the underpinnings of what it means to not be recognized in the record because you took what we understood as the ugly way out, or the bad way out, the suicide, the criminality, the violence, the rebelling, instead of just happily writing yourself through your crafts, through your friends, which is what permeates this first book. But in the second book, I really want to tend more to the complicated feelings that also came during this period, and how they have a conversation, how movie going for young women have a conversation with this very fraught historical period in the US.
Yeah, I mean, that's a crucial part of the larger story. And obviously you engage with that ambivalence, right? The fraught suffering, mental health struggles, material insecurity that underpins some of these queer bursts of feelings that are, archived in the scrapbooks like that. That's visible, that's palpable in your first book, but I'm glad to hear that you'll be, devoting a separate study to the let's say, you said underpinning, maybe we can say underbelly. Do you have a title for the second project yet?
It's called Desire Will End Me. It's very, yeah, that's I don't perfect. Think no book, you know how it is, like you come up with these kinds of like evocative or meaningful to you titles, and then like when you meet the editor, they go like, no, that's really abstract, just call it something else. Like the title for this one, I think came like, I don't know, 2 or 3 months before we published the book.
Oh, so, really?
Oh
Interesting.
yeah, it was not this title. There were many other titles that they're like, we appreciate that you really love reading 19th century poetry. We appreciate your love for Faulkner, but or Nabokov, those really like long-winded writers. But please pick a title that conveys the meaning of your book.
Were there any outtakes that you want to share today? Any titles that maybe you were attached to that your editors vetoed?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. The first ever, I didn't even make it to the dissertation, was From the Throbbing Darkness. Yeah, yeah. And
That's
I mean,
so good. I would rent that VHS in a heartbeat.
exactly, like it has that bodice ripper vibe, like of the throbbing manhood. And the funny part is that it's actually a quote from Faulkner from The Sound and the Fury. So it was actually like quote unquote high fluting lit, but it did not sound like that at all. So no, that was like not even my dissertation advisor allowed that. They were like, that means nothing.
Ooh, steamy. Well, I think Desire Will End Me like perfectly sort of squares that circle. In terms of bodice ripper that also conforms to the conventions of academic title publications.
We can hope. We can always
Desire
hope
Will
for like
End
a
Me.
second book, right? You get a little bit more freedom.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah. Well, anyway.
I was gonna like
You
segue for your book.
Well, I'm in we can sideline that topic. There's a little bit of contention regarding the place of a colon in the
Oh,
potential title of my, but I don't want to know, I don't want to spoil anything, and I want to focus
no, no,
on
no.
your work and your book, which is so brilliant. I just devoured it. I really couldn't put it down. I was late to multiple Zoom meetings as a result of it. So thanks for
You're
that.
welcome. You're very
If
welcome.
that's not
But
a high recommendation, I don't know what is. And I guess like I think we've gone a little over an hour, but I just wanted to we've already talked about your next project, but is there anything else we didn't get to that you really wanted to make sure to speak to before we wrap up today about the first book, a recent article, a forthcoming publication, or some little tidbit you found among your ephemera that didn't quite make it into print? Any final words?
oh, I appreciate that so much. I did publish recently about this anti-heteronormative way of feeling and how that also is a part of a conversation about female queerness and moviegoing in the early 1920s. And it did come out in Cinema Journal, I think, in the winter. So that is like a sneak peek into my book. And at the same time, I wrote a social history piece just for the for the Journal of Women's History that is just about the girls' suicide pandemic of the 1910s.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
I know it was very much about targeting particularly Eastern European immigrants that had menial jobs, understood as menial jobs in America. And so it was because the Bolshevik Revolution was starting to take place, there was this understanding that those kinds of immigrants were dangerous, like contagious figures. And so they imploded from the inside by killing themselves, but often after creating havoc around them. It kind of intersects with those ideas of the servant girl problem pictures that emerged in the 1910s. So it's like, it's panic about immigration, it's about gender, it's about very much about class and the idea of white passing immigrants marrying or getting together with Americans men and like polluting the bloodline. So it's very much this conversation about medicalizing and feminizing the suicide impulse. And I was really into that. And it has nothing to do with film. So it's like, it's where I got to have a break from thinking about cinema. That, and then I have a piece talking about how historicizing social feelings in female fandom and kind of connecting the kinds of fandom practices that are taking place, particularly on Tumblr, which is known as a digital scrapbook, is known as like the fandom website, the place where fandom is taking place nowadays, where it congregates, and how it kind of a throwback to the kinds of practices that were being enacted and devised by female fans in the 1910s. So that is coming out in feminist media histories. Yeah,
Oh, in which issue? In the
it's
fall
a
issue?
special one. Yeah, it's the winter one. It's on media identopias.
Oh,
Um,
Identopias. That's exciting.
yes, it's a special issue that is coming out in winter. I think January next year. We just met up in St. Louis to like hash out and have like a workshop on it, and it was a really great experience.
That is
So
Rebecca Wanzo, one of the co-editors.
yes,
Excellent.
it's her, exactly. Thank you
Love
for
her
reminding me
work.
of her name.
Much
Yes, so
anticipated.
she is the special issue editor. Her and her colleague Reem. I am her last name is escaping me right now, but they're both at St. Louis. I'm sorry, I should say the Washington University at St. Louis. Apologies. So yeah, so that, and then I have another piece that is just about consent and like the ideas of bodily autonomy as they pertain to female stardom in early Hollywood. But that's coming out also next year in an anthology about adolescent desire and consent in history and film history.
Amazing. You are so prolific. And so after everyone binge reads your book, A Queer Way of Feeling, I'm glad now we have a nice little bibliography of recent and forthcoming articles to look into, which I'm going to start downloading immediately to fill the void of having just finished A Queer Way of Feeling, which I just like. It bears repeating how much I love this book. Congratulations, Diana. It's such a brilliant work. I'm really excited for the whole world to read it. And thanks so much for being in conversation with me. I really, really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much it means to me to have someone that I respect so much and whose work I find so brilliant actually reading my work and being so generous with their time and with their thoughts. So thank you so much for reading it and for giving your time and your mind to this talk.
Well, my pleasure. And that means a lot. Mutual appreciation to that mutual fan club.
Yay, wonderful. Thank you. I will let you go, let the conversation go. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And congratulations again.